Surviving the Applewhites, Chapter 13. Edie was alone in the schoolroom, sitting at the computer with her hands pressed over her ears. Jake and his canine shadow Winston had gone into Treybridge with Archie to get some supplies for the woodshop, and Lucille had taken Destiny along to the library. Jeremy Bernstein was still staying in Dogwood Cottage. He had decided to write a book about what he insisted on calling the Applewhite Artistic Dynasty, and he had been practically monopolizing the schoolroom computer, working on the book and exchanging emails with his TV friend, trying to arrange a documentary about them all, or a story on a magazine show at least. But he was out in the woodshop now. It was a chance to get online and do her math, except that she couldn't concentrate. Edie had always thought you could get used to sounds, the way you got used to smells after a while. Sensory fatigue, it was called. You would get so you didn't notice anymore. Like Destiny's nonstop chatter. She told Jake it was like getting used to a refrigerator motor, and she'd been right. Everybody got used to Destiny. You couldn't survive in this family otherwise. But this was different. This was worse. Much, much worse. This was torture. She'd heard somewhere that when the cops or the FBI or somebody had wanted to end a siege with a militant cult, they'd beam rock and roll music at them from high-powered speakers. She could understand why it would work. Only they shouldn't have used rock and roll. They should have used the sound of music. It would have been faster. After 24 hours, the people in the cult would have laid down their guns and come out on their hands and knees, eyes as crazed as Wolfie's, singing compulsively about female deer and kitten whiskers. For 5 days now, her father had been playing the CD of The Sound of Music all day. Every day. He said he needed to totally immerse himself in the musical ambiance of the show. So everybody was being totally immersed in the musical ambiance of the show. Her mother had begged him to use earphones, but he refused, of course. They not only destroy your eardrums, they mess up your brain waves. So the music blared from the living room speakers, not just through the whole of the main house, but out the open windows and all over Wits End. Upstairs, Hal had gone almost silent for a while after the UPS man dropped off a roll of chicken wire and 2 gigantic bags of plaster. The sign on his door that had once read, Hal Applewhite, Painter, now said Hal Applewhite, Sculptor. But whatever he was sculpting with, chicken wire and plaster, Hal had taken up hammering again. Purely, Edie thought, in self-defense. Sybil had turned up the volume on the white noise machine in her office and had taken to wearing earmuffs in order to keep writing her great American novel. Cordelia swore the sound carried out to the dance studio. Her ballet, she claimed, was changing from a discordant tragedy to something resembling a polka. Most days Lucille stayed in Wisteria Cottage with all the doors and windows closed and the curtains drawn. She said it was the only way she could write poetry that didn't fall into rhymes like thread and bread, mitten and kitten. Edie figured it was the music that had sent Jeremy Bernstein out to the woodshop. He could do interviews with Zedediah and Archie out there where the power tools overwhelmed any other sounds. It wasn't that Edie didn't like the music. She did. But the constant repetition had worn grooves in her brain. Even in those few blessed hours when Randolph took the CD and went off to Treybridge for what he called his eternal, unending, utterly futile auditions, there was no respite. The music kept playing over and over in her mind. She would catch herself humming it, whistling it. It wasn't just the hills that were alive with this music. It was the trees, the grass, the house, the universe. Even worse, Jake had taken to humming it as well, so that if she did manage to drive it out of her mind briefly, he might bring it rushing back at any moment. Randolph Applewhite didn't very often direct musicals, and when he did, he usually went somewhere else to do it. Some other city in some other state. If he ever got this show cast, and if the family survived the rehearsal period, Edie was going to suggest they make a family rule against his ever again directing a musical from home. Partly to get away from the music and partly because it had become an obsession, Edie had spent a good part of the week in the meadow by the pond, in the pine grove, anywhere, and everywhere on their 16 acres looking for a great spangled fritillary. When she came back each day, the unused camera on its strap around her neck, her net empty, Jake's smirk seemed to get bigger and broader. Edie didn't give up easily, but she was beginning to lose hope. September was the last month they were supposed to be out there, and they were listed as rare during the second half of the month. There were only 6 more days in September. It was beginning to look likely that the butterfly project would end with a gaping hole in the chart. It drove her nuts. The great spangled fritillary was a common butterfly. The book said so. She should have found one weeks ago. It was just some nasty twist of fate that she hadn't found one. It was like a curse. If Jake Semple hadn't come into her life, she was absolutely certain she would have found one by now. But he had come, and then he challenged her. She told him that she would find one, and now if she didn't, Jake Semple would win. Everything else about the project was finished. The papier-mâché caterpillar and chrysalis were sitting on a shelf in the schoolroom, painted according to the pictures in her book, and she'd scheduled the teaching opportunity about metamorphosis for the first of next week. She was going to explain to Destiny how the caterpillar turned itself into the chrysalis, and then how she would cut the chrysalis open and explain how the monarch butterfly that she had a photograph on the chart had climbed out of it and flown away. The teaching opportunity and a paper describing the project and its results were what she called the culminating events. Her paper was almost done. It was just waiting for a paragraph on the great spangled fritillary, or else the statement that she had to give up on finding one. A statement of defeat she couldn't bear to think about. There were no official grades in the Creative Academy, but Edie always graded herself on her projects. It gave her a sense of where she was, what she had done, and most of the time a comforting feeling of accomplishment. But without the great spangled fritillary, she was going to have to give herself a B in science for the first half of this term. She was not used to getting Bs. She worked and worked until she felt sure she had earned an A. This fritillary thing wasn't something that she could do by hard work. It was totally out of her control. Worse, she'd been so determined to find one that she had fallen behind in every other subject, including math. Her math tutor had sent her an email asking if she was sick. She was doing her best to catch up now, but the more she tried to concentrate, the more she was aware of the voice singing, "Climb every mountain." It filled the house, urging her to climb mountains, ford streams, follow rainbows. Suddenly, a new voice joined in the one pouring out of the living room speakers. Jake burst into the schoolroom, singing at the top of his lungs that she should keep climbing and fording and following. Mercifully, when the final chord had died away, the CD ended and the house was suddenly silent. Hal's hammering stopped with the music. Jake stood there smirking, his hands behind his back. Winston had come in after him and now flopped at his feet. "The song's right," Jake said. "About what?" "About finding your dream if you look hard enough." "Well, I wouldn't call it a dream exactly, not mine anyway, and there weren't any mountains involved. But I found it." With that, he brought out from behind his back a clear plastic box, like the kind nuts and bolts come in. Lying in the box, its wings battered, its body shriveled, was a great spangled fritillary. "You killed it," she said. "It was dead when I found it." "Guess where?" When she didn't guess, he told her anyway. "Stuck to the front of Archie's truck, inside the grill. It must have been there for days, maybe even weeks." Edie stared at the battered insect. There was no mistaking what it was. She wanted to cry. This was almost as bad as ending with a hole in the chart. The butterfly project would get an A now, but it wouldn't really be her A. It would belong to both of them.